twilight of the 14th century, a storm was brewing in the east. The Ottoman Empire, a rising juggernaut, swept through the Balkans and Anatolia with unrelenting force. The Battle of Kosovo in 1389 left the Balkans under Ottoman dominion, and the once mighty Byzantine Empire clinging to the shadow of Constantinople's walls. Europe, fractured by petty rivalries and consumed by the 100 Years' War between England and France, stood divided, its strength sapped by internal strife, blind to the looming threat. The Ottoman advance sent ripples of fear across the continent. In 1394, Pope Boniface IX issued a clarion call to arms, igniting the fading embers of the crusading spirit. King Sigismund of Hungary, his lands under siege by Ottoman blades, took up the cause with fervor. That August, his desperate envoys stormed the opulent court of Paris, painting a chilling picture of 40,000 Turkish warriors marching on Christian soil. Their plea for aid struck a chord. King Charles VI of France, fresh from a fragile peace with England sealed by his daughter's marriage, declared it his sacred duty to defend Christendom and crush Sultan Bayezid's ambitions. The French nobility, their hearts ablaze with zeal, rallied to the cause, joined by a tide of nobles from across Europe, united in a fleeting dream of glory. Once all the Crusader forces had gathered, King Sigismund of Hungary was delighted at the sight of the large army assembled around him in Buda. Knights and soldiers from all over Europe had come, and the army totaled some 20,000 men. The French army was led by Charles the Fearless. The French component also included many high-ranking nobles and knights from Burgundy. The Hungarian army was led by King Sigismund of Hungary, who also served as the overall commander of the Crusader forces. The Burgundian forces were led by Philip II, Duke of Burgundy, who played a significant role in organizing and supporting the crusade. There were also German troops led by various German nobles and princes. The German force included knights and troops from the Holy Roman Empire. The Knights Hospitaller also arrived, led by the Grand Master of the Order. There were smaller groups of knights and soldiers from regions such as Italy, Poland, and Wallachia, led by their respective local leaders and nobles. King Sigismund was pleased that so many had come and was confident of victory. The strength of the Ottoman forces was also estimated at 20,000 men. The Ottoman force included 2,500 Serbian heavy cavalry knights under the command of Prince Stefan Lazarevic, who was Sultan Bayezid's brother-in-law. The crusade set forth from Dijon on April 30th, 1396. The Crusaders marched along the Danube River with the aim of expelling the Turks from the Balkans and then going to the aid of Constantinople. They planned to march through Turkey and Syria to liberate Palestine and the Holy Sepulchre before returning in triumph to Europe by sea. Their first target was Vidin, previously the capital of Western Bulgaria and then under Turkish control. The ruler of Vidin, Ivan Sratsimir of Bulgaria, having no desire to fight for his Turkish conquerors against an overwhelming force of crusaders, promptly surrendered. The only bloodshed was the execution of Turkish officers in the defending garrison. This incident convinced the French that the Turks were incapable of challenging the Crusaders in the field. And so the Crusaders became overconfident. The next target was Oryahovo, a strong fortress located 75 miles from Vidin. Frustrated by the lack of opportunity to show their bravery and deeds of arms, the French carried out a forced march at night to reach the castle before their allies. They arrived in the morning, just as the Turkish forces had come out to destroy the bridge across the moat. The French attacked. In fierce combat, the French secured the bridge but were unable to push forward until Sigismund and the main force arrived later that day. The other Crusaders arrived, and the forces combined and managed to reach the walls of Oryahovo. The next morning, the inhabitants of Oryahovo agreed to surrender to Sigismund on the assurance that their lives and property would be spared. The French broke Sigismund's agreement, pillaging and massacring the town after the gates were opened. The Crusaders continued toward Nicopolis, assaulting one or two settlements along the way. Crucially, they bypassed one citadel, from which messengers escaped to inform Bayezid of the Christian army. Bayezid, now aware of the Crusader advance, moved swiftly to counter the threat. He mustered his forces from his Anatolian and Balkan territories. Nicopolis, located in a natural defensive position, was a key stronghold controlling the lower Danube. Well defended and well supplied, the Turkish governor of Nicopolis, Doğan Bey, was certain that Bayezid would come to the aid of the town and was prepared to endure a long siege. The Crusaders finally reached Nicopolis, but lacked siege weapons. This, along with the formidable fortifications, made taking the castle by force impossible. The Crusaders set up positions around the town and settled in for a siege to starve out the defenders. After 2 weeks of siege, foragers venturing away from the camps brought word of the Turks' approach. Sigismund then sent 500 horsemen to carry out reconnaissance, and they brought word back that the Turks were indeed coming. Word also reached the besieged inhabitants of Nicopolis, who blew horns and cheered. However, Marshal Boucicaut claimed the noise of their celebration was a ruse, as he believed that the Sultan would never attack. One of the few to concern himself with scouting the situation was Diu, who took a group of 500 knights and 500 mounted archers south. Learning of a large group of Turks approaching through a nearby pass, he separated 200 horsemen to carry out a feigned retreat, drawing the pursuing Turks into an ambush. Leaving no quarter, Diu's men killed as many as they could before retreating to the camp. Once Diu and his men returned to the camp, Sigismund called a war council. He suggested a battle plan in which the Wallachian foot soldiers, who had experience fighting the Turks, would be sent in the first attack to meet the Turkish vanguard. The French knight Philip d'Artois denounced the proposal as demeaning to the knights, who would be forced to follow peasant footmen into battle. He reportedly stated, "To take up the rear is to dishonor us and expose us to the contempt of all." There was initially a disagreement between the French generals, with some wanting to take the advice of Sigismund and others wanting to take the advice of d'Artois. But in the end, the French decided to listen to d'Artois and advance. With the French set on a charge, Sigismund left to make a battle plan for his own forces. At daybreak the next day, knowing that the Ottomans were coming, the Crusaders began to organize themselves under the banners of their leaders. The French knights, accompanied by their mounted archers, rode out to meet the Turks. The Knights Hospitaller, Germans, and other allies stayed with the Hungarian forces under Sigismund. The French knights charged. They came under heavy fire from archers and were hampered by rows of sharpened stakes. They crushed the untrained conscripts in the Turkish front line and advanced into the lines of trained infantry. They managed to drive back the front lines of the Ottoman force. Coucy and Vienne recommended that the French pause to reform their ranks, to give themselves some rest and allow the Hungarians time to advance to a position where they could support the French. However, they were overruled by the younger knights, who, having no idea of the size of the Turkish force, believed that they had just defeated Bayezid's entire army and insisted on pursuit. The French knights continued the pursuit. More than half were dismounted by this point, due to many horses being killed by arrows or stakes. Struggling in their heavy armor, they reached the plateau at the top of the slope, where they had expected to find fleeing Turkish forces, but instead found themselves facing a fresh corps of Ottoman troops whom Bayezid had kept in reserve. Around them, the French realized how desperate their situation now was. Some knights fled back down the slope, while the rest fought on. While the French were almost surrounded on the hill, the main Crusader army under the command of Sigismund finally caught up. Seeing this, the Ottomans sent troops to deal with this threat so they could maintain their advantageous position around the French force. Ottoman cavalry flanked around. Now the Crusader army was almost surrounded. Wallachian and Transylvanian cavalry were then sent to deal with the Ottoman cavalry that had managed to reach the rear of the Crusader army. The Crusader cavalry broke the Ottoman cavalry, but once they had done so, they retreated to the camp to preserve their troops. The entire French force at this point had either retreated, been captured, or killed, and so Bayezid could send more and more men to attack the main Crusader force. At this point, the Turks received a reinforcement of 1,500 Serbian knights under the command of Stefan Lazarevic, which proved critical. Sigismund's force was overwhelmed. Sigismund retreated back to the main camp, and the rest of the Crusader force was either killed or captured. By the end of the battle, almost the entire Crusader army of 20,000 men was either killed or captured. The Ottomans also suffered considerably. The number is uncertain, but it was certainly in the thousands. Once back at the camp, Sigismund stated to the Hospitaller master, "We lost the day by the pride and vanity of these French. If they believed my advice, we had enough men to fight our enemies." The Ottomans gathered all of the prisoners. The Turks recognized Jacques de Helly, a French knight who had served under a previous Ottoman sultan, and had him identify the nobles for ransom. Those judged to be under the age of 20 were taken as slaves by the Turks. The rest of the several thousand prisoners had their hands tied and were marched naked before the Sultan. A group of executioners proceeded to kill every prisoner, either by decapitation or by severing their limbs from the body. The rest of the noble captives were forced to stand beside Bayezid and watch the executions. The killing continued from early morning until late afternoon, at which point Bayezid, either himself sickened by the bloodshed or convinced by his ministers that he was unnecessarily enraging Christendom against him, called off the executioners. Of those who fled the battlefield, few survived. Most drowned trying to escape back over the Danube, and those crusaders who made it across were reduced to wandering through the woods in rags. Many of the starved survivors died along the way. The remaining prisoners who had not been executed were forced to march the 350-mile length to Gallipoli. January 9th was declared a day of mourning throughout France. A delegation with rich gifts for Bayezid left Paris on January 20th, 1397, to negotiate the ransoms. French negotiators in the Sultan's court reached an agreement on a ransom of 200,000 gold florins. The last of the Crusaders, along with 7 or 8 other knights, re-entered France in February 1398. The defeat highlighted the disunity and lack of coordination among the European powers. It also led to a reassessment of strategies for dealing with the Ottoman threat, eventually contributing to more organized and concerted efforts in future conflicts, such as the formation of the Holy League. The Ottoman victory at Nicopolis maintained their pressure on Constantinople, tightened their control over the Balkans, and became a greater threat to Central Europe.